Welcome back. So today we're going to take a look at Tronsmart's Onyx Prime TWS. So looking at the box, you can see they threw out a bunch of buzzwords right on the front of the box. So let's kind of go through it real quickly. So Qualcomm's AptX, you're looking at high resolution codec for Bluetooth on Android only. If you're iOS, you're going to be back at AAC like normal. Made for audiophiles, not too sure what that's about, but it's big letters. And hybrid dual driver. So what's unique about Onyx Prime is it actually is a true hybrid. It is a 1DD, 1BA hybrid, which is a bit unique at this price point for TWS especially. So inside the box, pretty basic stuff. You get a nice diagram, and you can kind of see the dynamic drivers right here, and the BA is actually in the nozzle, and we'll see that in 1 second. You do get a set of the ear hooks, the little ear hook thing that locks in your ear to keep it secure, and a set of tips. And so that is what's in the box. What does it look like? This is the case. It's a pretty basic TWS case. It's actually quite thin, a little tall. So each TWS is a little bit unique looking. So not quite your standard IEM shell. This is definitely more of a TWS form factor. This is the ear hook that I mentioned. They give you an extra set of those, 4 charging pins, which is a little bit unique too. And there's a touch sensitive button on the back, as well as I think 2 microphones. So as I said, inside the nozzle, if you look there right in the middle, you can see that little rectangle. That is your BA pointing straight in your ear from the nozzle. And a little vent there that you could almost see in the reflection. So not super unique, but quite nice form factor, especially for a TWS. Especially if you're used to traditional IEM shapes, it's a little different. But I don't have that much of an issue with the fit or the style or the button. All those things are pretty much functional. So as I said, starting with the front of the box, good buzzwords. So Qualcomm's QCC 3040 chip. That is a high quality Bluetooth chip that you see on lots of Bluetooth devices and TWS and other Bluetooth devices as well. So good choice on that chip. So AptX Adaptive, that is the multi-bit rate version of AptX. For those of you who are familiar with the older AptX, I think it was a static bit rate, 400 or so kilobit. Adaptive will actually cycle up to save you some battery life, but keep up sound quality as well. So BT 5.2, that gets you independent use of each side. So on some older TWS, you had this weird issue. If you put one in the case, you couldn't use the other one. So 5.2 really brings that capability of using each side independently to pretty much any set that supports 5.2. And battery life, they call it 40 hours, but that's really about 10 hours, so it loses about 10% per hour. You get about 10 hours, and you can recharge it 44-ish times. So that's kind of where they get the number of 40 hours of playtime, but think of it as 10 or less is in that ballpark. So number 2, so what's a little bit unique about this one? Good drivers. So good buzzwords and good drivers are the two things that are 2/3 of the way there to getting a good set of TWS. And I think this one actually does a really nice job on the drivers. I think they could have really cheaped out on the BAs, which is what KZ has done on occasion. And you end up with a DD. The lower half of a track sounds pretty good, and the upper half just has that metallic KZ sound. And I think they did, in this one, I think they did a really reasonable job on picking a BA that actually is coherent and blends in nice with the DD. I was kind of shocked when I heard it. I was like, well, that's actually pretty good. Someone actually thought about that decision and put some good drivers in it, as well as the good codec. So 2/3 of the way there. So price appropriate, $49 US after a 30% discount coupon. I think that's very price appropriate for where you're getting a hybrid, decent sounding TWS that supports AptX. I think that's right there at the right price point. So the third part, buzzwords, drivers, tuning, right? So questionable tuning out of the box. It is crazy bass heavy. very much a bass cannon and pretty far out of balance. So, I think they got 2/3 of it right. The other third, questionable. I'm not really sure what they were going for with having an out-of-the-box tuning like that. That was so bass heavy that it sounded a little out of whack. But the good thing is that there's an app for that. And let me see if I could pull it up real quick. So Onyx Prime. So this will search for Onyx Prime. Probably won't find it because there's no connection. So hopefully it will find it now that those are searching and pairing. Maybe. Maybe not. There we go. So the app is actually the Tronsmart app, and I think it actually works with multiple of their TWSs. But for Onyx Prime, this is essentially what it looks like. So quick overview. But what we're really interested in is this tuning. And this is essentially the first problem, is when you pull the TWS out of the case, it defaults to this really strange tuning. And I'm not even sure where that comes from, but it's very bass heavy. So the default and the original, both of them end up being a much higher bass level than it actually appears from this graph. So the one I ended up using was hi-fi, which you can see basically brings down the bass quite a bit. And so that's the one I used. The app isn't really loving what I'm doing right now for some reason, but that's the gist of the app. So you end up with this tuning out of the box that's super bass heavy, and there's an app where you can control the EQ. So the rest of this, all this stuff, it's kind of based on, which EQ that you choose. And I chose hi-fi, but, these are just general things. The sound is very much dependent on how you EQ it. It's kind of a do-it-yourself TWS, which is kind of odd, and I'm not sure that's going to be a success doing it in this style, and especially giving you a default that was so bass heavy and out of balance. But whatever, it is what it is. So warm V, you got plenty of bass, and let's just talk about the graph, because it's easier to go over it with the graph than it is to talk about some of the words. So like I said, so out of the box, Tronsmart Onyx Prime default, the bass level is like, at the top of the chart. It's huge. And then it drops down into this kind of steep V, and then it pops way back up as well. So you end up with a really big V shape, and great, lots of bass, lots of upper end, and then this is recessed as you would imagine because it's right there in the valley. So through EQ and that hi-fi option, you end up with the red line. So much less bass. Still, you're going to end up with some recessed mids, but the upper end is actually somewhat reasonable as well. So, your EQs end up somewhere between the two. You can customize between the two, but I stuck with hi-fi. I mean, the default one out of the box is pretty out of whack, and there's just so much bass that you really can't hear anything else. So I do think they picked good drivers and they handle EQ very well, but why they chose this default mode, I'm not really sure about that. So warm V, plenty of boost on either end, as I said. Very good for outdoor use, which is where I use TWS mostly. Lots of bass, lots of treble, makes it easier to hear over the noise outside. Good AptX implementation, plus good drivers. You get pretty good sound quality from those two, and the resolution still not quite what you're going to get out of a $50 wired set, but pretty good. I mean, I'm kind of impressed what they did at this price point with these drivers, with AptX Adaptive. Tuning wise, as I said, a little bit wacky. So bass, big, huge, fun, impactful level, set by default, but turn it down with EQ, as I said. For balance, try the hi-fi, which is the one I showed you. Not the most detailed or quality, but it's also not it doesn't really get out of control either. So it's not really boomy or distorted or lacking at all. So, but ultimately, it's going to depend on your EQ, how much bass you really put into your ears from that level. So the mids can be V-shaped, recessed a bit, but BA really helps keep that sound sharp and separated, and vocals clear over the bass. Without that upper end shining through, I think it would be really dark, and I think they did a really good job of choosing a BA that really complemented so much bass and kept the mids quite clear. So I think pretty good design choice right there. It just could be richer, which is really hard at BT bit rates, and that's kind of what, that realism that you hear in vocals. I think that's really hard over Bluetooth codecs. I think that's the part that really always gets compressed out a little bit. Voices are definitely kind of smoothed over. You don't really hear all that texture that you should, but in this case, I think it just comes across a little sharper and a little more detailed than it would have been if they didn't have the upper mids as kind of rising as they do. So the treble, it's a bit thin, but it really stands against the bass. And I don't have too much of an issue with the treble. It's probably better than a few of the KZ TWSs that I've tried that are at or at the same price point. And it's quite extended. For a TWS to actually go a treble this far extended without it blasting your ears off, I think they actually did a pretty reasonable job there. And especially for an outdoor set where you want this boosted quite a bit, just to be, over the sound of cars or whatever you're trying to block out. Pretty good job. And with the extension, I don't really have any issues going on, especially with the treble. And it's not metallic. It doesn't pop out of place. There's nothing kind of weird, shrieky about it. And it sounds pretty reasonable. It's kind of, at some point I was kind of questioning where they got their BA from. They probably didn't develop it, but it's pretty reasonable. So, and especially with this EQ, so you can kind of see the default one has this pretty steep rise, and at higher volumes, that's not great for me. And then continuing onward, upward, it's probably less great for me at higher volumes outside. So with hi-fi, with this lower rise, I could raise the volume up a little bit more and make up the difference between these two, because the treble, rises with volume. And so I tend to, especially on TWS, would prefer this little lower set and then just raise the volume, as opposed to listening at a lower volume and having all this bass and all that treble and just having to keep the volume down. So just my personal preference on how I use TWS that way and which tuning I prefer that way. So stage, it definitely feels deeper than wide. It's not really wide enough. It's kind of on the border. And imaging is okay. Simply because there's too much bass. It's not wide enough. There's no height. So compared to your regular IMs, the stage is kind of the bit that falls off, especially at the $50 point. But not too bad. Having it feel deep is much better than, and again, part of it is just which tuning you choose. Higher trebles tend to put everything in your face. It won't feel as deep. So this lower set, I think, feels deeper, and it makes up for not being as wide as it should. So that's about it. That's all I got on the Tronsmart Onyx Prime. So thank you again for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.